Ethan sat at the bar, drumming his fingers on the counter, watching the clock tick closer to closing time. The raven's nest was quieter than usual tonight, probably because of the heavy storm brewing outside. The rain pelted the windows, and thunder rolled ominously in the distance. The few regulars who braved the weather sat nursing their drinks in silence, while the TV overhead buzzed with static due to the storm. He had started this job 6 months ago, thinking it would be an easy gig. The late shifts at a bar known for its peculiar crowd and even stranger history didn't faze him at first, but over time, the place started to get under his skin. There were always rumors about the bar being haunted. Locals said it was built on cursed land, and many people had disappeared over the years after drinking here late into the night. Ethan had always shrugged off these stories as nothing more than local folklore, until that night. The man in the back booth was an odd sight. Ethan didn't recall seeing him enter, and he had been sitting there unmoving for hours. His coat was drenched from the rain, and his dark hat obscured most of his face. Every time Ethan glanced over, the man seemed to be staring into his glass, never lifting his head. Ethan watched the man from behind the bar. The other customers had trickled out over the past hour, leaving him completely alone with the mysterious stranger. A few minutes before closing, Ethan decided to approach the man to see if he needed anything before locking up for the night. But as he rounded the corner of the booth, the man was gone. His whiskey sat untouched on the table, still full, and the bar tab remained unpaid. Ethan stared in confusion. He hadn't heard the door open or close. The bell above the entrance, which jingled whenever someone came or went, remained silent. He grabbed the whiskey glass, inspecting it. There were no fingerprints, no signs that anyone had even touched it. Unease crept up his spine, but he dismissed the thoughts, telling himself the guy must have slipped out unnoticed. But when he checked the security cameras to make sure, what he saw made his blood run cold. There was no sign of the man at any point in the footage. Ethan rewound the tape several times, scanning the bar from the moment his shift began, but it was as if the man had never existed. The booth he had been sitting in was empty all night. Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but this was something else. Just as Ethan was about to turn off the cameras and head home, the power went out. The bar was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the room. Ethan fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight app, and began making his way toward the back to check the fuse box. He hated going back there. The storage room always felt wrong somehow, like something was watching him from the shadows. As he passed the dark hallway, he heard a low dragging sound coming from the back. It was faint, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable. His heart raced as he approached the door. The dragging noise stopped abruptly as he placed his hand on the door handle. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly pushed it open. The storage room was dark, and the air was thick with the musty smell of damp wood and cleaning supplies. Ethan stepped inside, his phone's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. His eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of place, but everything seemed normal. Then, as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang, making him jump. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned back toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he pulled harder, the door refusing to open. He was trapped. That's when he saw it. A shadow shifting in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as his eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. It was the man from the booth, standing perfectly still, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. Ethan froze, paralyzed by fear. The man didn't move, didn't say a word, but the oppressive feeling in the room was suffocating. Ethan's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. How was this possible? The man had disappeared. He had checked the cameras. He wasn't real. But here he was, standing just a few feet away, watching him with an unnerving stillness. The figure finally moved, its head slowly lifting to reveal a face that was not entirely human. The eyes were sunken, black voids, and the mouth was twisted into an unnatural smile, as though the skin had been stretched too far. Ethan stumbled back, heart pounding in his chest as the figure took a slow, deliberate step toward him. In a moment of sheer terror, Ethan rushed for the door again, yanking it with all his strength. The door flew open, and he stumbled into the hallway, sprinting toward the exit. He didn't look back. The sense of something following him was overwhelming, but he kept running until he was outside, the cold rain soaking through his clothes as he fumbled with his car keys. As he sped away from the raven's nest, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the parking lot, watching him leave. But there was nothing there. Only the empty road and the dark silhouette of the bar fading into the distance. Ethan never returned to the bar. He handed in his resignation the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something evil lurked within its walls. Whatever he had seen that night wasn't human, and the haunting presence of the man in the booth would stay with him forever. It was almost midnight when Sarah noticed him. The bar was rowdy, filled with regulars and out-of-towners who had wandered in from the nearby interstate. The storm outside was intensifying, making the windows rattle with each gust of wind. Sarah was the only bartender on duty that night, and she was eager for her shift to end. But something about the man in the corner booth made her pause. He had been sitting there for over an hour, alone, staring into his drink. His clothes were unremarkable, and a plain leather jacket, dark jeans, but there was something off about him. Every time she passed by, his eyes would follow her, his gaze unsettlingly intense. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his fingers tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm on the table as though keeping time with an invisible song. Sarah wasn't one to get spooked easily. She'd worked in bars for years and had seen all sorts of strange customers. But this man, there was something wrong about him. She tried to shake the feeling and focus on her other customers, but the unease gnawed at her. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Sarah noticed that the man still hadn't touched his drink. It sat there untouched, the ice slowly melting. She decided to approach him, figuring it might be time to see if he wanted anything else or if he was just lingering until closing. "Hey, everything okay over here?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The man looked up at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something flicker in them, something dark and menacing. But just as quickly, it was gone, and the man smiled. His smile was thin, almost forced, like he had forgotten how to do it properly. "I'm just waiting for last call," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah nodded and walked away, but the strange feeling in her gut didn't go away. As the hours passed, more customers left until eventually only a few stragglers remained. It was nearly closing time now, and the storm had grown worse. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the bar in harsh, flickering light. The man in the corner hadn't moved. When she called last call, the remaining patrons ordered their final drinks and started heading for the door. But the man stayed in his booth, watching her. When Sarah glanced over at him, she felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes never left her. "Sir, it's closing time," she called over, trying to keep her voice steady. The man stood up slowly, his movements unnervingly deliberate. He walked toward the bar, his boots making heavy thuds on the wooden floor. As he approached, Sarah noticed something strange about the way he walked, like his legs were stiff or uncooperative, almost as if they didn't belong to him. "I'll settle up then," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, crumpled bill. But when he handed it to her, Sarah froze. The bill was old, worn, and unlike anything she'd ever seen. It looked like a relic from a bygone era, faded and yellowed with age. We don't accept this," Sarah stammered, handing the bill back. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against his. The man's expression didn't change, but something about his face seemed darker now, more menacing. His eyes gleamed in the low light, and for the first time Sarah noticed a strange, pungent smell emanating from him. like decaying wood mixed with something metallic. "Don't worry," the man said, his voice dropping lower. "I always pay my debts." Suddenly the lights flickered. A low rumble of thunder shook the bar, and the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone. The glow from the screen provided only a faint light, but in the dimness, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The man's shadow stretched across the floor, impossibly long and distorted. It writhed and twisted like it had a life of its own, reaching toward her. Sarah stumbled back, the phone slipping from her hands as she backed into the wall. "Stay away from me!" she shouted, her voice trembling. The man's shadow continued to move, creeping closer, but the man himself remained perfectly still, his expression blank. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as the shadow reached her feet, curling around her legs like tendrils. She tried to move, but her body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. The bar was silent. The man was gone. Sarah looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. The booth where he had been sitting was empty, the old bill lying on the table. The storm outside raged on, but inside, everything was eerily still. She quit her job the next day, unable to shake the memory of that night. The man, his shadow, the strange old bill, she didn't know what had happened, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never work a night shift at a bar again. It was a slow Thursday night at the Rusty Nail, a small old-fashioned dive bar nestled between abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town. Jack, the bartender, was wiping down the counters as the last few customers trickled out, the smell of stale beer lingering in the air. The place had a reputation, not just as a bar, but as a spot where strange things happened late at night. Jack had always dismissed the rumors as small-town gossip, but tonight would change everything. The clock above the bar read 1:45 a.m., just 15 minutes until closing. Jack was ready to lock up when the door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. A woman walked in, her heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. She wore a striking red coat that contrasted sharply against the bar's dingy, dim-lit interior. Her face was pale, framed by jet-black hair, and her eyes, dark and haunting, scanned the room before she approached the bar. "One whiskey, neat," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bar's old refrigerator. Jack poured the drink, sliding it over to her without a word. There was something about her, not just the red coat or her eerie calmness, but something deeper. The way she moved, the way her eyes lingered on things too long, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But he kept quiet, assuming she was just another late-night wanderer looking for a drink. As she sipped her drink in silence, Jack noticed something odd. Every now and then, she would glance toward the far corner of the bar, a dark, secluded booth where no one sat. Her gaze would fixate there for a few seconds before she returned to her drink, as if she were watching something invisible to everyone else. "Everything all right?" Jack asked, trying to break the tension that seemed to have settled in the room. The woman didn't respond at first. Then, without turning to face him, she spoke in a hushed tone. "He's been watching me." Jack frowned, glancing over his shoulder at the empty booth. "Who?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. "The man in the corner," she whispered, her fingers gripping the glass tighter. "He's been following me for weeks." Jack's stomach dropped. The booth had been empty all night. He had been behind the bar the entire time, and no one had gone near it. He felt a cold chill creep down his spine, but he forced a casual smile. "There's no one there," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "You must be mistaken." The woman finally turned to face him, her eyes wide and terrified. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He's always there." Before Jack could respond, the lights flickered. A low, unsettling hum filled the room, making the bottles on the shelves vibrate slightly. The air grew heavy and the temperature dropped suddenly, like someone had opened a window in the dead of winter. Jack looked toward the booth again, and this time his breath caught in his throat. There, in the far corner, a shadowy figure sat, barely visible in the dim light. His face was obscured, but his outline was unmistakable. A man hunched over, watching them. Jack blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the figure remained unmoving. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, backing away from the bar. He turned to the woman, but she was gone. Her red coat was still draped over the bar stool, but she had vanished without a sound. Panic surged through him as the hum grew louder, the lights flickering more violently now. Jack grabbed his phone, but it was dead. The figure in the corner began to move, slowly standing up, its form stretching unnaturally tall as it loomed closer. Jack's heart raced as he backed toward the door, his hands fumbling for the keys. He had to get out, now. But as he reached for the handle, the door wouldn't budge. He turned, and the shadowy figure was inches away, its presence suffocating, its face still hidden in darkness. "Leave me alone!" Jack shouted, banging on the door. And just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights flickered back to normal. The hum ceased, and the bar was silent. Jack turned around and the figure was gone. The booth was empty, the only sign of the woman being her red coat, still draped over the bar stool. Jack quit his job that night, never telling anyone what he saw. But every so often, when he drives past the Rusty Nail, he swears he sees a figure in the window, sitting in that same corner booth, watching, waiting.